What if Robert Baratheon fostered Jon Snow with the Martells in Dorne? The war had ended, but the silence that followed it was heavier than any battle cry, and it was in that silence that Eddard Stark rode north from the red mountains of Dorne with a burden cradled against his chest that no banner could name. The infant slept as newborns do, wholly trusting, ignorant of the blood that ran within him and the promises sworn over a dying woman in a tower where roses had wilted in the summer heat. Ned had made those promises in a room that smelled of iron and dried petals, and he carried them now the way a man carries a stone lodged behind his ribs, feeling its weight with every breath, unable to set it down and unwilling to name it aloud even to himself. The royal progress moved slowly through the parched country of the Dornish marches, a great serpent of horses and wagons and men-at-arms, and at its head rode Robert Baratheon, newly crowned, still flushed with the terrible joy of having won everything he had bled for. He was a mountain of a man in those days, broad and laughing, his warhammer slung across his back, as though he might need it still, though the last of his enemies lay cold beneath the trident, or scattered to the far corners of the earth. Yet beneath the laughter, there was a restlessness in him, a hunger that victory had not sated, and it turned in his belly like a coal that would not cool. He had heard the whispers that followed the fall of King's Landing, the murmurs carried on the tongues of servants and soldiers, that some child of Targaryen blood had slipped through the net Tywin Lannister had cast, that not every dragon had been crushed beneath the golden lion's paw. It was near a dry riverbed, where the willows grew gray with dust, and the water had shrunk to a thread among the stones, that Robert drew Ned aside from the column and looked at the bundle he carried. The king's eyes, blue and bright and terribly shrewd for all his rough manner, moved from the sleeping infant to the face of the man he had called brother since boyhood, and something in that gaze made Ned's spine go cold despite the beating southern sun. "They say you brought a babe out of Dorne," Robert said, and his voice was quieter than Ned had ever heard it, a low rumble, like distant thunder before a storm has quite decided whether to break. "They say it has the look of the dragon about it. Tell me true, Ned, for I have killed men and I have killed children this past year, and I will know if you lie to me." The words hung between them in the still, hot air, and Ned felt the whole weight of Lyanna's secret pressed down upon him until it seemed he could scarcely draw breath. He thought of his sister's face gone pale upon the birthing bed, the fever bright in her eyes, and the blood soaking through the linens, and the way her fingers had clutched at his wrist as she made him swear, again and again, until the promise had bound them both. He thought of the child's true name and true blood, and he understood in that instant that to speak them here would be to sign a warrant of death, for Robert's hatred of the dragon ran deeper than any river and colder than any winter. So Ned did the thing he had never done before in all his honest life, and he lied to the man who trusted him above all others. He said the child was his own, or nearly his own, a bastard he had gotten upon a Dornish woman during the campaign, a boy born of a knight he was not proud of and could not undo. The words came haltingly, for lying did not sit easily in him, but Robert took the halting for shame, and shame was a thing the king understood far better than honor. For a long moment Robert said nothing, and then he began to laugh, great booming laughter that startled the crows from the gray willows and drew glances from the men strung out along the road. He clapped Ned upon the shoulder hard enough to stagger him, and the suspicion drained from his face like water from a cracked cup, replaced by a delight that was somehow more dangerous than his anger had been. For in that moment a thought had seized the king, a notion born of the shrewd political mind that so many men forgot lay behind his bluster, and Ned watched it take shape in Robert's eyes with a growing dread he could not yet name. "A Dornish bastard," Robert said, savoring the words. "Ned, you great grim fool, do you not see what you have brought me? I have Elia's blood on my hands, hers and her children's, and all of Dorne looks upon me now as they would look upon a serpent in the bedchamber. Doran Martell nurses his grief in Sunspear and dreams of vengeance, and the whole of the South trembles at the thought of what he might do. But here is a northern lord's son, half Dornish by birth, a bridge between the cold north and the hot sands. Foster the boy with the Martells, Ned. Let Dorne raise your bastard as a gesture of my goodwill, and let them see that the north and the throne bear them no ill will. It will soften them. It will bind them." The proposal struck Ned like a blow, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt beneath him. To send the child south, into the very household of the family Robert had wronged, seemed madness of the cruelest kind. And yet, even as the horror of it rose in him, another thought crept quietly beneath, cold and reasoning, and impossible to silence. In the north, the child would remain forever within Robert's reach, forever subject to the king's whims and the sharp eyes of his court. And every year the boy grew, the risk would grow with him that some resemblance, some whisper, some careless word might undo everything Lyanna had died to protect. The ship that carried the child southward crossed leagues of green water beneath a sky that seemed to widen with each passing day, until the cold gray light of the north fell away entirely, and the sun grew heavy and golden and unrelenting overhead. Aboard that ship rode a household guard of Winterfell, a broad and taciturn man, a cousin of Roderick Cassel, whose loyalty had been proven in a dozen quiet ways, and beside him a wet nurse from the winter town, whose milk was warm and whose songs were soft, and between them lay the infant swaddled in wool far too heavy for the climate they approached, sleeping through the long days as ships have a way of lulling the very young into sleep. The men who sailed her knew only that they carried a bastard of consequence, a lord's mistake being sent to be raised out of sight, and they asked no questions, for questions in those days had a way of ending badly for the men who asked them. When the towers of Sunspear rose at last from the shimmering haze of the coast, pale and ancient and crowned with the fierce sun and spear of House Martell, the guard felt a coldness settle into his belly that no southern heat could touch, for he understood well enough into whose keeping he delivered this precious burden. The party came ashore in the shadow of the old walls, past merchants and fishermen and dark-eyed children who watched them with frank curiosity, and they were led through winding streets that smelled of salt and spice and sun-baked stone until they came at length into the presence of the Prince of Dorne. Doran Martell received them in a shaded hall where the light fell in narrow golden bars across a floor of intricate tile, and he sat very still in his chair, a man not yet bound by the gout that would one day cripple him, but already possessed of that terrible patience which made him so dangerous to those who mistook his stillness for weakness. He looked upon the child for a long moment and said nothing, and in that silence the guard felt every fear he had carried across the sea gathering weight. When at last the prince spoke, his voice was quiet and unhurried, and he said only that it was a strange gift indeed for the usurper to send into Dorne, a northern babe wrapped in the false silk of goodwill, and that he wondered what precisely Robert Baratheon imagined he purchased with such a courtesy. Behind the prince, half in shadow, stood his younger brother, and Oberyn Martell did not trouble to conceal the fury that lived in him still. The wounds of the sack were fresh upon Dorne, for it had not been so very long since Elia had been butchered in the Red Keep with her children beside her, and the man who had done that murder yet walked free and unpunished in the service of the very king who now sent this infant as a token of his tender regard. Oberyn looked at the child the way a man looks at a serpent left upon his doorstep, and he said that he would sooner see the boy fed to the sands than raised at any Martell hearth, that no bastard sent by Robert's hand could ever be anything but an insult wearing the mask of a kindness. His brother let him speak and did not answer him at once, and there was between the two of them the old and familiar tension of the fire and the water, the one who burned and the one who waited. But Doran was a man who saw further than his grief allowed his brother to see, and even as Oberyn's anger filled the hall, the prince was turning the matter over in the cool machinery of his mind, weighing what advantage might be drawn from a thing that seemed at first only an affront. To refuse the fostering would announce to the throne that Dorne nursed its grievances still, that it could not be trusted, that it stood ready to strike, and Doran had no wish to reveal his hand so early in a game he intended to play across the span of many years. To accept it, by contrast, would clothe Dorne in the appearance of loyalty and reconciliation, would let the North believe the arrangement generous, and the crown believe Dorne pacified, and all the while the boy himself would rest within Doran's reach, a living thread that ran back to Winterfell and to the loyalties of Eddard Stark, which the prince very much desired to understand. A child, held gently and raised plainly, could be many things in time. He could be a courtesy, he could be a hostage, he could be a coin not yet spent. So the prince gave his answer, and it was not the answer his brother wished to hear. He would take the boy, he said, and he would name him Jon Sand, a bastard's name marked with the sand that all Dornish baseborn children carried, and he would place him in the water gardens where the sons and daughters of the high and the low splashed together in the pools, and no man could easily say who among them was of noble blood and who was not. There the boy would grow unremarkable and unwatched, dark of hair and gray of eye among 100 other dark-haired children, and Dorne would learn from him and through him whatever the years cared to reveal, and the North would think Dorne kind, and the throne would think Dorne tamed, and only Doran would know the truth of what he kept beneath his roof. Oberyn turned and left the hall without another word, and his silence was heavier than his anger had been. The wet nurse gathered the infant closer, uncertain whether she had delivered him into safety or into some slower peril she could not name, and the prince beckoned that the child be brought nearer, that he might look upon this small, pale stranger who had crossed a kingdom to lie in his hands. The boy did not cry. He looked up at the Prince of Dorne with wide gray watchful eyes, and Doran Martell, who trusted almost nothing, felt something in him pause. The years in Dorne did not pass so much as they drifted, warm and unhurried, like the water that moved through the marble channels of the water gardens and pooled in the shade of the blood oranges. By the time the boy had grown to 5 and then to 6, he had become a fixture among the children who lived and played there. A dark head among many dark heads, his gray eyes, the only mark that set him apart from the sons and daughters of Dornish servants and Dornish lords alike who splashed together beneath the fountains. He answered to the name of Jon, and he had never known any other, and if he wondered where he had come from, he did not wonder aloud, for the pools were full of children who had come from nowhere in particular and who belonged nonetheless. There was a girl among them who did not let anyone forget she was a princess, though she was small enough still to fit her whole hand around a fallen orange. Arianne Martell moved through the gardens as though the water and the marble and the other children were all arranged there for her pleasure, and she treated Jon with a mixture of affection and command that shifted from one moment to the next, so that she might kiss his cheek in the morning and order him to fetch her a cup of watered wine by afternoon, as though he were her sworn shield. He obeyed her more often than not out of fear, but because it seemed to please her, and because pleasing her made her laugh, and her laughter was a sound worth working for. She called him her northern shadow, and pulled him into games he did not understand. And when the other children whispered that he was a bastard, she looked at them with a scorn so complete that the whispering stopped. For in Dorne, a bastard was not a thing to be pitied or scorned, and no one knew that better than the daughter of a prince. There were others too, wilder than Arianne and less bound by any softness. The daughters of Oberyn Martell came and went from the gardens as their father's travels allowed, and the eldest of them, a hard-eyed girl named Obara, who already carried herself as though she had been born holding a spear, took Jon's measure early and found him not entirely wanting. She was rough with him, as she was rough with everything, but there was a kind of acceptance buried in her roughness, and her sister Nymeria, sleeker and quieter and quicker to smile, drew him into their circle with an ease that came of never having questioned whether an orphan child deserved a place among them. In Winterfell he would have sat below the salt and eaten in silence, while true-born children were served first, and he would have learned young the particular loneliness of being neither servant nor son. Here he learned no such thing. Here he was simply another child of the water, and Dorne gave him, without ceremony and without even seeming to notice it was giving anything at all, a belonging he could not have named and would never have known beneath the gray walls of the north. It was Oberyn who noticed him truly, though it took some time. The Red Viper returned from one of his long wanderings, sun-darkened and restless, full of poisons and grievances, and a curiosity that never rested. And at first the boy was to him only the crown's insult made flesh, the living reminder of a gift he had wished to refuse. He watched the child the way a man watches a stone that has been thrown into his house, waiting to see what it might break. What he saw instead, one warm afternoon beside the deepest of the pools, was Jon stepping between a larger boy and a smaller one, planting himself there with his fists clenched and his jaw set and his gray eyes gone hard, refusing to move, though the larger boy was near twice his size. There was no calculation in it, and no hope of reward, only a grave and stubborn sense that a wrong was being done and that he would not stand aside from it. And Oberyn, who had spent his life among men who calculated everything, felt something in him bend toward the boy in that moment. He began to teach him after that the rudiments of it, how to hold a spear and how to move his feet, how to make his small body a difficult target rather than a still one. He told himself it was for amusement, and it did amuse him, but there was more in it than that, and he took a particular pleasure in mentioning the lessons to his brother whenever the two of them sat together in the cool of the evening. "Your northern hostage grows into a fighter," he would say, watching Doran's face for the flicker of unease he knew was there. It would be a shame to waste him. Doran said little in reply, as was his way, but he watched the boy too, and he watched the letters that came from the north. For there were letters, careful and infrequent, sealed with the gray direwolf of House Stark, and Doran read each of them more than once. Lord Eddard Stark wrote stiffly, as a man writes who is unaccustomed to opening himself upon a page, and yet, beneath the stiffness, there ran a current of feeling that no formality could quite conceal. He asked after the boy's health and the boy's letters, and whether the boy was kind to those beneath him, and he sent, from time to time, small sums for the child's keeping, though no keeping had been asked of him. There was guilt in the ink, thick and unmistakable, And there was something else that Doran turned over in his mind through many long and quiet nights. For a man did not grieve so plainly over the fruit of a passing dalliance in some southern bed. Doran Martell had spent his life listening to what men did not say, and in the silences between Eddard Stark's careful words, he began to hear the shape of a question he could not yet answer, and he folded each letter away and filed the inconsistency in the patient vault of his memory against a day he could not yet see. By the time the boy had seen 8 name days pass beneath the Dornish sun, he had become something the North would scarcely have recognized as its own. The soft roundness of childhood had burned away in the heat of the water gardens, and in its place had grown a leanness of limb and a quickness of eye that the masters marked with quiet approval. Each morning, before the worst of the heat descended, Jon rose from his cot while the palms still dripped with the coolness of night, and he made his way barefoot across the pale stone terraces to the courtyard where the training began. There the masters of the spear waited for him, patient men with weathered hands and endless corrections. And there, more often than not, Oberyn Martell himself stood watching, with folded arms and a smile that never quite reached the depths of his black eyes. The Dornish spear was nothing like the heavy longswords the boy might have swung in Winterfell's yard, nothing like the brute contest of strength and iron that the men of the North called martial skill. It was a thing of distance and rhythm, of feint and withdrawal, of striking where the enemy was not yet defended and vanishing before he could answer. Oberyn taught it as he taught everything, which was to say obliquely, wrapping each lesson in words that seemed at first to have nothing to do with the matter at hand. Strength was for fools who wished to die young and admired, the prince told him once, twirling a spear between 2 fingers as though it weighed nothing at all. The clever man let his enemy exhaust himself against empty air, and then he struck once, in the soft place, and walked away. Poison, too, had its wisdom, for a blade in the dark asked no permission and offered no fair fight, and the prince spoke of these things without shame, as a farmer might speak of the seasons, and the boy drank it all in and did not yet understand how strange it would have sounded to the ears of the man who had sired him. The sand snakes had taken to him as though he had always belonged to their fierce and laughing company. Obara, hard as the desert stone, taught him to spit and to hold his ground when older girls tried to shove him from it. Nymeria, all silk and menace, taught him where a knife should go to end a man quickly and where it should go to end him slowly, and she seemed delighted that he learned the difference so well. Tyene, golden and soft-voiced, showed him the small vials she kept and named their contents as another child might name her dolls, and the sweetness of her manner never quite hid the poison beneath. They called him brother, these wild daughters of the Red Viper, and there was no ceremony to it and no grant of blood, only the easy acceptance of children who had decided a thing was so and would hear no argument against it, and the boy who had grown up a bastard beneath the cold suspicion of a proud lady's gaze felt, for the first time in his short life, that he had been folded into something that wanted him. Yet there were moments when the warmth of the water gardens gave way to something older and darker, and these came most often when Oberyn spoke of the war. He did not speak of it gently. He spoke of his sister Elia, of her laughter and her ill health and her too gentle heart, and then he spoke of what had been done to her within the walls of King's Landing when the city fell, and his voice went flat and terrible in a way that frightened the boy more than any raised shout could have. He told of her children, the girl and the babe, of small bodies wrapped in crimson cloaks and laid before a usurper's throne as though they were prizes, and the name of the mountain fell from his lips like a curse he had sworn upon his own soul. and the name of the Lannisters after it. Something took root in the boy then, a hatred he did not fully comprehend, but felt in his chest like a stone, a certainty that these were the wickedest men who had ever drawn breath. And Jon, listening, would sometimes speak of the murdered Targaryen children with a child's simple pity, and each time he did, the prince would fall silent and stare at him with an expression the boy could not read, a searching, hungry, sorrowful look that lingered too long and was gone before it could be questioned. It was in the boy's 8th year that Doran Martell summoned him, alone, to the shaded gallery where the Prince of Dorne passed his slow and swollen days. Jon came uncertain, for he had rarely been in the older brother's presence, and the man in the wheeled chair seemed to him as still and patient as the mountains themselves. Doran asked him gentle questions that were not gentle at all, questions about loyalty and duty, about to whom a man owed his sword and his heart and the whole of his devotion. And the boy, thinking on it with the grave seriousness of one who has been raised to consider such matters, answered that he owed his loyalty to those who had raised him, to those who had fed him and taught him and named him brother, and that a man who forgot such debts was no true man at all. Doran Martell studied the child for a long while after that, and something moved behind his tired eyes that was both satisfaction and unease. For he understood, in that quiet gallery with the water murmuring beyond the pillars, that the North's ward had become in his heart a son of Dorne, that whatever blood ran in the boy's veins, his soul had been shaped here beneath the serpent's watchful eye. It was a thing of enormous value, this loyalty, a thing that might one day be turned toward ends the boy could not begin to imagine. And Doran folded the knowledge carefully away beside the letters and the inconsistencies, and he smiled, and he sent the child back to his lessons. The packet came in the last days of autumn, borne by a road-worn rider whose horse had carried him across half the realm, and it bore upon its wrappings the dire wolf of House Stark, pressed into pale gray wax. Jon was near 13 then, tall for his years and dark of hair in a way that set him apart from the sun-browned children of Sunspear, and when the steward placed the bundle in his hands, he stood a long moment simply holding it, feeling the strange weight of a thing that had traveled so far to reach him. Inside, there was a cloak of thick northern wool, dyed the deep gray of storm clouds, lined with dark fur that smelled faintly of pine and smoke, and some cold green country he had never seen. And folded within it was a letter written in a careful, unhurried hand. He read it in the shade of the water gardens, where the fountains threw their spray into the warm air, and children laughed somewhere beyond the orange trees, and the words felt out of place there, as though they had been written in a language his heart half remembered, but his tongue had never learned. Ned Stark wrote of the North, of the way the snows came early that year and lay heavy on the godswood, of children Jon had never met who bore his blood in some crooked, unspoken fashion, and of a hope, expressed with a plainness that was almost painful, that the boy was well and warm and cared for. There was warmth in it, real warmth, and beneath the warmth a sorrow that Jon could not name, but could feel, the way one feels the shape of something submerged just beneath still water. It stirred in him a hunger he had kept carefully starved for years. He had never truly wondered before, or had trained himself not to, for the wondering brought no answers and only made the days heavier. Yet now, with the cloak across his knees and the strange, tender words before his eyes, he found himself asking the question that would not stay quiet, and that evening he brought it to Doran. The prince sat, as he so often did, upon his terrace, his gouty legs wrapped in linen, a cup of watered wine untouched at his elbow, while the last light bled from the sky. Jon asked him plainly why a lord of the north, a man he had never met, should take such interest in a bastard of Dorne, should send him gifts and letters warmer than any Jon had known. And Doran, who had been expecting some form of this question for the better part of a decade, answered him with the patient half-truths he had long since prepared, speaking of old debts between great houses, of the strange webs of obligation that bound the realm together, of promises made in the aftermath of war. It was enough to satisfy a lesser curiosity, but Jon saw the careful spaces between the words, felt the shape of what was not being said, and when he asked, quietly, about his mother, the prince's face closed like a door in winter, and he spoke only of a woman long dead and best left to her rest. Jon did not press. He had learned, in Dorne, that some silences were themselves a kind of answer, and he carried the letter and the cloak and the unsaid things back to his chambers and lay awake with them for a long time. The years had made Arianne into a woman now, dark-eyed and quick-tongued, and fierce in the way of the sun she had been born beneath, and she had grown accustomed to Jon's steady presence at the edges of her days. She trusted him as she trusted few others, for he wanted nothing from her, coveted no advantage, sought only her company for its own sake. And so it was to Jon that she came when the resentment grew too great to carry alone, pacing the length of her chambers in the moonlight, while he sat quiet and listened. Her father favored her uncle's counsel above her own rights, she told him, treated her as a bauble to be married off, rather than the heir she was by every law of Dorne, whispered in shadowed rooms with the Red Viper, while she was kept at arm's length from the true business of ruling. There was fire in her when she spoke of it, and something wounded beneath the fire, and Jon, who understood better than most what it was to feel unwanted by those who ought to hold you dear, gave her the only thing he had, which was his listening and his loyalty and his silence. Something grew between them in those long confidences, something warmer and more complicated than either would have named aloud. And Doran, who missed little that happened within his walls, watched it grow with the wary calculation of a man weighing a thing that might prove either treasure or catastrophe. He said nothing. He simply watched and folded that knowledge away beside all the others. The wider world pressed in upon them even here, at the sun-baked edge of the realm. Word came from King's Landing of the fat king upon his stolen throne, of Robert Baratheon drowning his crown in wine and whores, and the hunting of beasts, of debts piled so high that the whole realm seemed to groan beneath them, and of the golden Lannisters tightening their grip upon the coffers and the councils and the ear of the king. Oberyn heard these tidings with a hungry light in his eyes, speaking openly at the family table of old wounds unhealed, of a sister and her children broken upon a stone floor, of a debt of blood that the years had not paid and would not pay until it was paid in kind. Jon listened to all of it, absorbing the shape of the seven kingdoms as a man might study a map, and he began to understand that what the maesters called peace was no true peace at all, but only a wound crusted over, waiting for the lightest touch to open it once more and spill everything red into the light. By his 14th year, Jon had grown tall in a way that set him apart from the boys who ran the courtyards of the water gardens, and it was this growing that first betrayed the secret the adults had kept so carefully coiled around him. He had gone to the kitchens one evening in search of nothing in particular, drawn by the warmth and the smell of bread, and there he found two of the older serving women bent over their work, their voices low with the easy carelessness of those who believe themselves alone. They did not hear him at the threshold, and so he heard them, and what they said fastened itself into him like a hook. It was strange, one of them murmured. How the boy grew more northern with every passing season, how his face lengthened toward that solemn Stark cast, all long bones and gray eyes, and a jaw that no Dornishman had ever worn. Too much of the North in him for a mere Dornish bastard, the other agreed, and there was something knowing in the way she said it, something that made Jon's skin prickle in the heat of the ovens. When at last they saw him standing there, they fell silent and turned back to their kneading, and Jon walked out into the cooling dark with the words following him like a second shadow. He did not sleep that night, and in the morning he sought out Doran Martell where the prince sat wrapped against the faint chill in the loggia that overlooked the pools, his gouty legs propped and his hands folded upon the arms of his chair. Jon came to him without the careful courtesy that had been drilled into him across the years, and he asked, plainly and with the roughness of a wound freshly opened, who his mother had been. The old prince regarded him for a long while, his heavy-lidded eyes giving nothing away, and the water below them lapped gently at the marble, as though marking the passage of some invisible time. When Doran spoke at last, it was with the practiced gentleness of a man who had weighed every possible answer and chosen the one that told the least. He said that Lord Eddard Stark loved Jon more deeply than Jon could yet understand, that the silence surrounding his mother was not cruelty but protection, and that some truths, once spoken aloud, could never again be gathered back into safety. He did not deny that there was a mystery. He did not soften it with lies. He only laid his weathered hand upon the boy's arm and told him, with a weariness that seemed older than his years, that the question was best left buried, for burial was sometimes the only mercy a man could offer to the living. The answer satisfied nothing in Jon, and it was in the grip of that dissatisfaction that he did a thing he had never dared before. He took parchment and ink to the small room where he slept, and by the light of a single guttering candle, he wrote directly to Eddard Stark, the man who had sent him south and never once come to see him, the father whose face he could scarcely remember. He asked, without ornament, who his mother had been, whether she yet lived, whether she had loved him or only left him. He sent the letter north with a trader's ship, and then he waited through the long turning of a season, and when the reply came, it came in a hand he did not know, careful and pained, the letters pressed hard into the page, as though the writer had struggled against each one. Ned Stark told him only that his mother had loved him, that she would have kept him at her side had the world allowed it, and that Jon must never, upon his life and honor, seek to learn more than that. The words meant to comfort him wounded him instead. For a boy of 14 hears in evasion only the confirmation that he is not worth the truth, and Jon folded the letter small and set it away and resolved, with the hard certainty of the young, that he would not be defined by a father who would not name his mother, nor a North that had cast him off. He was of Dorne now. Dorne had raised him, fed him, taught him the spear and the sun. Dorne, at least, had not lied to his face. Yet the deepest unease came not from Winterfell, but from within the very household that sheltered him. And it came on a night when Oberyn Martell had drunk more of the strong Dornish red than even he was accustomed to hold. The red viper was in one of his black and brooding humors, the kind that came upon him when old griefs stirred, and he had drawn Jon close beside him on the terrace beneath a sky thick with stars, speaking of blood and lineage and the strange inheritances that ran in the veins of the great houses of Westeros. He spoke of the Targaryens then, of their silver hair and violet eyes, of the fire that some said still slept in their line, and his gaze fell upon Jon with a peculiar weight, and his mouth opened around words that seemed to shape themselves toward something enormous. "There is more of the dragon in you than the wolf, boy," he began. and seemed on the very edge of saying more. But even drowned in wine, some deeper instinct caught him at the very edge of the precipice, and he stopped, and his eyes cleared for a single startled instant, and he laughed too quickly and turned the words aside into a jest about northern gloom and Dornish sun. Jon felt the sudden withdrawal like a door slammed against his fingers. He said nothing, but he understood, in that moment, that the secret which surrounded him was no small thing left unspoken out of habit or discretion. It was something the very Prince of Dorne guarded even in his cups, something that touched not merely the mystery of his mother, but the mystery of what he was. And Jon lay awake long after Oberyn had stumbled off to his bed, staring into the dark, feeling the shape of a truth pressing against him from every side, unseen and enormous. The season turned toward summer's height, and word came from Sunspear that a wedding was to be held, one of the many branches of the Martell line binding itself to another Dornish house of standing, and with the wedding came the promise of a tourney such as the sands had not seen in many years. Pavilions of orange and crimson silk sprouted along the ground beyond the city walls like flowers after rain, and the smell of roasting meat and spiced wine drifted across the encampments while banners of 100 houses snapped in the dry wind. Lords came down from the passes and up from the coast, and among them rode men from beyond Dorne's borders, come to see whether the tales told of Dornish spearwork held any truth. And the lists were made ready, and the sand was raked smooth, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath in the heat. Jon did not ride as Jon Snow, nor as the ward of Prince Doran, for such a thing would have drawn eyes he had learned to shun, and so he entered the lists beneath a plain sigil without meaning, a bare field of gray without charge or word, and he told those who asked only that he was a hedge knight of no particular consequence. But the disguise held only so long as his spear remained still. When the melee began and the dust rose in choking clouds and men fell away on either side of him, he moved as the Dornish had taught him to move, low and fluid and impossibly quick, the spear an extension of his own arm rather than a weapon gripped in his hand. And he unhorsed a knight of the Reach who outweighed him by half, and turned aside a blow that should have felled him, and answered it with a thrust so clean that the man yielded before the point had even touched him. The crowd, which had come expecting little from an unknown boy in gray, rose to their feet as the day wore on, and a name began to pass among them, whispered first and then shouted, for they had seen how he struck and coiled and struck again, and they called him the Northern Serpent, half in jest and half in something like awe, a wolf's face and a Dornishman's blade, and the strangeness of it delighted them. From the shaded galleries, the visiting lords leaned toward one another and spoke behind their hands, and more than one of them asked aloud whose blood had made such a fighter, for there was a look about the boy that troubled the memory, a long grave face and dark hair, and a stillness between the bursts of violence that seemed to belong to some house they could almost, but not quite, name. Among those seated in the galleries was a man in the crimson of Lannister, an envoy sent south on some minor matter of trade and courtesy, a careful man with a careful memory, and he watched the gray-clad ward with more attention than the sport alone deserved. He had seen Lord Eddard Stark once at court, years past, and something in the boy's face pulled at that recollection until the resemblance seemed too plain to be chance, and he made his quiet inquiries among the servants and the stewards, and he learned that the boy was no hedge knight at all, but a ward kept these long years within the walls of Sunspear, a northern child raised in secret in the deep south. The envoy said nothing of what he thought, but he wrote it all down in the small hand he used for such things, and when he returned to King's Landing, the observation passed from parchment to ear, and from ear to ear again, until at last it settled among those whose trade was suspicion, who wondered why the Warden of the North had placed a Stark-featured boy in the care of the one house that had lost the most when Robert took the throne. But all of that lay far off, in cold stone rooms Jon would never see, and on the night the tourney ended he knew nothing of the seed that had been planted. The feasting had drained away into the small hours, and he found himself walking the walls above the water gardens with Arianne beside him, the two of them wrapped in the quiet that comes when the noise of a great gathering has finally spent itself. She had watched him fight, and she told him so, and there was something in her voice that had grown warmer than the teasing of their childhood, and she asked him what he meant to do now that half the realm had seen his spear and wondered at his blood. He was quiet for a long while before he answered her, and when he spoke, it was slowly, as though laying down a weight he had carried unseen. "I am bound to no house," he said, "and no name that is truly mine. I fight under a gray field, because gray is what I am, neither one thing nor another, a guest in a land that is not my own, and a stranger to the land that should be. My father gave me here and did not tell me why, and every man who looks at my face sees a riddle he cannot solve, and I am weary of being a question no one will answer." Arianne did not laugh, and she did not fill the silence too quickly, for she had heard the loneliness beneath the words and knew it for what it was. She turned to him in the pale light, and she said that whatever he was, whatever secret slept behind that grave face of his, Dorne had kept him and fed him and taught him and would keep him still, that this land beneath the stars was his home, as surely as if he had been born to it, that he need never wonder whether he belonged so long as she and hers drew breath. And Jon looked at her, and something in him that had held itself apart for years loosened at last. And in that loosening, a loyalty took root that would bend the shape of every choice he made thereafter, though neither of them yet understood how far its branches would one day reach. Word of the death of Jon Arryn reached Sunspear on the wings of a raven grown thin with the long southern crossing, and Doran Martell read the letter twice before he set it down upon the low table beside his chair, his gouty hands trembling only slightly, less from age than from the weight of what the parchment carried. The hand of the king was dead, and into the vacancy left behind the realm would rush like water into a broken hull, and every lord who had spent the years since the rebellion pretending peace would now be forced to remember that peace was only a season and never a settlement. He sat a long while in the cool dimness of his chamber, the sound of the water gardens drifting up through the shutters, the laughter of distant children softened by stone and distance, and he turned the pieces of the world slowly in his mind as a jeweler turns a gem to find its flaw. Then came the second letter, and it changed everything, for it told him that King Robert himself had ridden north to Winterfell to name Eddard Stark his new hand, and Doran understood at once that the old alignments of the court had shifted beneath his feet like sand in a receding tide. The man who had crushed the Targaryens, the man whose warhammer had ended Rhaegar upon the Trident, the man who had sat the Iron Throne through drink and indifference for 16 years, was now reaching out his hand to the very lord who fostered the boy that Doran kept close as a held breath. He did not speak of it to the servants who brought his broth, nor to the maester who read his correspondence aloud in the evenings, but he called for more ravens, for fresh ink, for the names of his agents in King's Landing, and in the Reach, and in the households of a dozen minor lords who owed him small debts, and he began to gather intelligence the way a spider gathers thread, patiently, without haste, letting each strand find its place before he wove the next. His brother did not share his patience. Oberyn came to him in the heat of the afternoon, with the salt of the sea still in his hair, and the restless fire of the road still in his eyes, and he leaned upon the balustrade of Doran's chamber and spoke of the opportunity that had opened before them, like a door left carelessly ajar. Ned Stark was an honest man, he said, honest to a fault, honest to the point of foolishness, and an honest man at the heart of a court of liars was a rare and useful thing, for such a man might be persuaded to reopen the question that had been buried these many years, the question of who had given the order that ended their sister and her children beneath the walls of Maegor's Holdfast. The mountain still lived and served the Lannisters openly, Oberyn said, his voice low and even, and terrible in its calm. And if there was ever a hand who might be shamed into justice, it was this grim northern lord who wore his conscience like a cloak he could not take off. Doran listened, and he did not answer at once, and when he answered, it was with the slow deliberation that had always driven his brother to distraction. He told Oberyn that the moment to strike was not the moment when the striking felt sweetest, that a blade drawn too early cut only the hand that held it, that they had waited 16 years and could wait a little longer while the pieces settled into places they could use. When Jon came to him that evening, as the boy often did, drawn to the old man's counsel despite himself, Doran shared with him the thought that lay beneath all his patience, speaking softly as the lamplight pooled upon the tiled floor. "The grass," he said, "does not fear the wind, and it does not fear the boot, for the grass bends and lives, while the tree that will not bend is broken. Yet in the grass sleeps the viper, and the viper does not strike at the first thing that passes, for it knows that a wasted bite leaves it defenseless. It waits, hidden, patient, until the throat of its enemy is bared, and then it strikes but once, and once is enough." Jon carried those words with him, but they did not soothe the restlessness that had grown in him since he learned that the king rode north, that the Starks he had never met now stood at the center of the realm's great turning. He came to Doran on the morning after and asked, with the careful courtesy of a young man who has learned to armor his wants in reason, whether he might be sent north while the court was gathered at Winterfell, whether he might at last look upon the faces of the family whose name was tangled somewhere in the riddle of his own. He was 15 now, tall and grave, and no longer a child to be told his place without explanation, and he made his case as best he could, that he had been kept in the south all his life, and asked only to see the land of his blood. Doran refused him, and he refused him gently, but he refused him wholly, and something in the flatness of the refusal told Jon that there was more beneath it than a foster father's caution. To bring the boy into Robert Baratheon's presence, Doran knew, was to risk waking whatever slept behind that face, to place a lit candle beside a store of oil and pray the wind stayed still, and he would not gamble the boy's life or the peace of the realm upon a young man's longing. Jon bowed his head and obeyed, for obedience had been bred into him beneath the Dornish sun. But as he walked back through the water gardens with the spray cooling his cheeks, he felt for the first time the bars of the cage that had always held him, and beneath his obedience, a slow and quiet resentment began to root itself in the dark. The word came by ship, as most tidings of consequence did, carried up from the harbor at Sunspear on the tongue of a merchant whose face had gone gray with the weight of what he bore. It reached the water gardens near midday, when the sun stood high and white above the pale stone, and the children of the court splashed and shrieked in the pools, without a care in all the world, and it moved through the household like a coldness passing beneath still water, felt before it was understood. Ned Stark, the hand of the king, the man they called the honest fool of the north, had been taken in the Red Keep and named a traitor. King Robert Baratheon was dead, thrown from his horse, or gored by a boar in the Kingswood. The accounts differed, and the boy Joffrey wore the crown now, a golden child with a golden smile, who had ordered the arrest of the very man his father had trusted above all others. Jon heard it in the shaded colonnade where he had gone to be alone with his resentment, and he did not at first believe it, for the shape of it was too large to hold. Eddard Stark was a name he had carried through his whole life, the way a man carries the memory of a house he was born in and never saw, a name spoken of him and never to him, the father who had sent him south and never once written and never once come. That such a man could be dragged in chains through the streets of the capital seemed impossible, and yet the merchant swore it, and swore too that Lord Stark's own daughters were held within the keep, and that the whole of the realm had begun to tilt and slide like a deck in a rising sea. He went to Doran that same afternoon, and he did not ask this time, he demanded. He stood before the wheeled chair in the cool, dim quiet of the prince's chambers, with his fists closed at his sides, and the blood high in his face, and he said that Dorne must act, that they must send ships and men, that they could not sit behind their mountains and their sands while an innocent man was murdered for a lie. Doran heard him out with the patience of a man who had heard many demands in his long stillness, and when Jon had spent himself, the prince spoke softly, telling him that Dorne could not save a fallen hand, that a single house could not reach into the mouth of the lion and pull a prisoner free, that the realm was already breaking along old fault lines, and that the wise course was to watch and to wait. Yet this time, Doran let slip a single condition, that should the North's cause and Dorne's ancient debt ever run the same course, he would move, and Jon carried that thread of hope back with him, changed. There was more in Doran's mind than he showed the boy, as there always was. He watched the great houses choose their ground the way a physician watches a fever climb, marking each new alignment against the long ledger he had kept for 16 years, and he weighed each of them, not for the strength they offered, but for the justice they might one day permit. He cared little for the vengeance of the Starks, however grievous their wound, for their dead lay far from his heart. He cared for Elia, always for Elia, for the sister butchered in her bed, and the small bodies of her children, whose blood had never yet been answered, and every shift in the game he measured against that single ancient debt. For a time, there was only waiting, and the waiting was its own cruelty. Word came thin and slow and contradictory, of ravens and armies gathering, and a boy king upon a stolen throne, and Jon moved through those days like a man walking through smoke, unable to see the shape of what was coming, and unable to look away from it. He slept badly. He took to the practice yard in the worst heat of the afternoon and drove himself until his arms shook and the wooden sword fell from his blistered hands, as though he might beat the helplessness out of himself with labor. Then, on a morning when the light came gold and gentle through the narrow windows and the fountains sang their same untroubled song, the last word came, and it was the worst of all. Eddard Stark had been brought before the people upon the steps of the great sept of Baelor, and there, in sight of the whole city, the boy king had ordered off his head. The hand of the king was dead, executed as a traitor, and his daughters wept somewhere behind the walls of the keep, and the North would rise now in a grief that would not be reasoned with. Jon did not weep. That was the thing that Oberyn marked, watching him from across the courtyard where the news had found them. The boy stood very still, and the color left his face, and something behind his dark gray eyes went hard and cold and terribly quiet. The grief, turning inward and folding into a shape that had edges. He mourned a father he had never known, a stranger whose blood he believed was half his own, and the mourning was made sharper and stranger for the fact that he had no memory to hang it on, only the empty ache of a bond that had been promised and never given, and now could never be. Oberyn saw all of this, and the Red Viper, who had spent his own years nursing a grief with edges, understood at once what stood before him. Here was fury without a home, loyalty without an object. A young man of the North's own blood, raised in the South's own halls, and Oberyn felt the old cold calculation stir beneath his sorrow, that this grief might be forged, that a weapon lay half-made in the courtyard if a man had the will to finish it. And as he watched the boy standing motionless in the golden light, he began, for the first time in earnest, to weigh the wisdom of telling Jon Snow exactly whose son he truly was. The word came south on the tongues of exhausted riders, and in the ink of ravens that fell upon Sunspear like a scattering of black leaves, and each one carried a portion of the same great unraveling, so that within the span of a single moon, the 7 kingdoms seemed to fracture along every ancient seam at once. Robert Baratheon was dead, they said, torn open by a boar in the Kingswood, and his heir crowned in haste while the lords of the realm circled the throne like wolves at a wounded stag. Then came the tidings that hardened the marble halls into something colder still, for Ned Stark had been named traitor and taken in the throne room by the very Kingsguard he had once served beside, and the North had risen to answer the insult with steel. Robb Stark, scarcely more than a boy, had marched his host south and shattered a Lannister army in the Riverlands, and the lords who followed him had lifted him upon their shoulders and named him king in the North, the first such king to reign in 300 years. Nor did the storm end there. Renly Baratheon, the youngest brother, had crowned himself with the strength of the Reach behind him and rode about the south with 100,000 men and a green pavilion that shone like a summer field. Stannis, the elder and the harder, brooded upon his island rock and claimed the throne by right of blood and law, and behind him a red woman spoke of a god of fire, and in the west of the world, upon his salt-worn islands, Balon Greyjoy raised the driftwood crown and declared himself a king of the Iron Isles, sending his longships against the very north that Robb had left half-guarded. 5 men wore crowns now, or claimed to, and the realm that Robert had held together with the sheer weight of his person came apart the moment that weight was lifted. Through all of it, Dorne held its silence, and that silence was the loudest thing of all to Jon. He walked the water gardens in those days with a restlessness that would not leave him, for every raven that came seemed to speak of Robb, of the North bleeding, of the family that had shaped his earliest and most tender memories, now marching to war without him. He had grown in the South, but his blood remembered snow, and the thought of Robb riding into battle while he lingered among fountains and orange trees was a torment he could not master. He went at last to Doran, finding the prince in his shaded chamber, with the gout swelling his joints and the light falling soft through the screens, and he spoke with more heat than he had ever dared. "The North is at war," Jon said, and his voice cracked upon the word. "Robb is my brother in all but name, and Dorne has spears enough to turn a battle. Why do we sit? Why do we water flowers while good men die?" And Doran regarded him for a long moment with those patient, sorrowful eyes that seemed always to be weighing something far heavier than the question at hand. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle and utterly immovable. "Dorne does not spend its strength upon the quarrels of northern boys," he said. "We have waited 16 years, longer, for a debt to be paid in the coin it is owed. When we strike for Elia and for her children, for the wrong done to my sister beneath the walls of the Red Keep, and for the advantage of my house and my people, not before, not for the Starks, not for you, The words fell upon Jon like cold water, and he understood in that instant that the warmth of the water gardens had always concealed a chamber of ice beneath, that Doran had loved him truly, and yet had never once forgotten what he might be worth. The grief and the calculation lived side by side in the old man, and Jon could not tell where one ended and the other began, and the not knowing sickened him. He had been raised by these people, had been given their sun and their sea and their tenderness, and now he saw that even their tenderness had a ledger behind it. Something between them tore that day, quietly, the way a rope frays strand by strand long before it parts. And Jon left the chamber feeling for the first time in his life like a stranger in the only home he had known. It was Oberyn who found him afterward, upon the high terrace where the wind came off the water and the light was turning to the deep amber of late afternoon, and the red viper stood beside him a long while without speaking, sharing the silence before he broke it. He had weighed this moment for years, had turned it over in the dark of many nights, and he judged that the boy's grief had at last worn thin enough to receive the truth without shattering upon it. "You have your mother's look about the eyes," Oberyn said softly, "and something of your mother's brother in the long grave shape of your face, the stark cast that Ned Stark could never own aloud. You wonder why Ned Stark could never speak of your mother. You wonder why he brought a babe out of the south and named it his own shame rather than utter a single word of who bore it." He let the silence stretch, and then he spoke the names as one lays down cards long hidden. Lyanna Stark did not run from Rhaegar Targaryen, whatever the singers claim, and a woman does not die screaming in a tower of joy for the theft of her honor. She dies so in the birthing bed. Jon turned to him, and the amber light caught the sudden pallor of his face, the whole certain architecture of his life trembling upon its foundations. For if the man spoke true, then he was no bastard at all, but the last living son of the prince whose murdered wife and children Dorne had mourned for 17 bitter years. The words hung between them in the amber-lit chamber, like motes of dust suspended in a shaft of failing sun. And Jon did not answer at once, for there was no answer that would not remake the whole of him. Oberyn watched the boy the way a man watches a fire he has kindled with damp wood, uncertain whether it would catch or gutter. And when Jon finally spoke, it was in a voice pared thin by the enormity of what he had heard. He said only that he did not understand, though the truth was that he understood all too well and could not yet bear the shape of it. And Oberyn, seeing this, did not press him further that night, but let the boy walk out into the warm dark of the water gardens alone, where the fountains murmured their patient song over the marble, and the children of the summer sun slept beneath the stars. But even as Jon wandered the pale paths beneath the blood-orange trees, turning the names over and over in his mind, as a man turns a stone he cannot bring himself to lift, other tidings were making their slow way westward across the narrow sea, and these tidings would change everything. They came first as rumor carried in the holds of trading galleys. A whisper passed from Pentos to Tyrosh to the wharves of Plankytown, and then, as the sworn report of merchants who had seen with their own eyes what no living man had beheld in a century and a half. A girl of Targaryen blood, silver-haired and violet-eyed, had walked into a funeral pyre on the grass of the Dothraki Sea and emerged from the ashes at dawn unburned, and with her, clinging to her body and crying out in voices no man had heard since the last of them died in chains, were 3 living dragons. When this news reached Doran Martell in the shaded quiet of his gallery, where he sat with his gouty legs propped upon a cushion and the sea wind stirring the gauze of the curtains, he did not cry out or start from his chair, for he was not a man given to such displays, but those who knew him marked how his hands tightened upon the arms of his rolling chair until the knuckles paled. For years beyond counting, he had nursed a design so patient and so secret that even his own children knew but fragments of it, a design woven of grievance and calculation, and the long, cold memory of a sister broken upon the floor of the Red Keep. And at the heart of that design had once stood his son Quentyn, whom he had meant to send across the sea, a plan he now quietly set aside, for the boy in his own gardens had become a surer key to the dragon than any betrothal to wed the last daughter of House Targaryen and bind Dorne forever to the dragon's restoration. Now the dragons were no longer a dream, spoken over wine, but a living fire loose upon the world, and the whole careful architecture of his vengeance trembled toward its hour. Yet even as one path opened before him, another threatened to cross it, and this was the source of the quarrel that broke between the two brothers in the days that followed. They met in Doran's private chambers with the doors barred and the servants sent away, and Oberyn, who had never in his life learned to speak softly of the things that moved him, laid the matter bare. He wanted to name Jon for what he believed the boy to be, to lift him up before all of Dorne as the true-born son of Rhaegar, the last living claim of the elder branch, a boy raised in their own house and loyal to it by every bond of gratitude and love. Doran heard him out with the weary patience of a man who has learned that patience is the only weapon left to the maimed, and when he answered, his voice was low and heavy with the weight of years. He told his brother that a second claimant did not double the dragon's cause, but split it, that lords who might have rallied wholly to Daenerys would now hesitate and calculate, that the very existence of a Targaryen son would poison the betrothal upon which he had staked the future of their house. He reminded Oberyn that the girl had dragons, and Jon had nothing but a face and a suspicion, and that in the game they played, suspicion unproved was worth less than nothing and cost more than gold. Oberyn answered that Doran would sacrifice a living boy who trusted them upon the altar of a scheme that might yet come to ruin, and the words fell between them sharp as the point of a spear, and neither brother yielded. And when Oberyn left the chamber, the sound of the closing door carried through the sunlit halls like the tolling of some distant bell. Jon heard none of the words, but he was not blind, and he had lived long enough among these people to read the language of their silences. He marked the guarded looks that followed him now, the way conversations folded closed at his approach, the strange new gentleness in Doran's manner that carried beneath it something perilously close to grief. He weighed all of it against the names Oberyn had spoken in the amber dark, and at last he went to the prince himself, walking unbidden into the shaded gallery where Doran sat watching the children play among the pools, and he asked the question plainly, without ornament, because he had learned that ornament was a kindness he could no longer afford himself. Doran looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment he might have lied, for he had lied to greater men for lesser reasons, but he found that he could not bring himself to speak falsehood to this grave and honest boy whom he had come to regard almost as a son. He told Jon that he could not prove it, that no man living could, but that he believed it likely, more than likely, that Rhaegar's blood ran in his veins. And then, because he loved the boy enough to frighten him, he warned him softly that this knowledge was a blade that cut the hand that held it, that it made him hunted by every Lannister in the realm, and a danger to the very household that had sheltered him. The word from King's Landing arrived on a merchant's ship that had beaten the wind up from the stepstones, and it came wrapped in the ordinary language of gossip before it hardened into something that could change the course of lives. Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf son of the Great Lion, stood accused of murdering the boy King Joffrey, and having been condemned by the whispers of his own kin, He had thrown himself upon the ancient right of trial by combat, demanding that the gods and steel decide his fate rather than the poisoned tongues of the court. And the crown, or rather the queen who ruled it in all but name, had named as her champion Sir Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, the great brute of a man whose hands had broken Elia Martell against the stones of Maegor's holdfast and dashed the life from her infant children on that day the world had chosen to forget. Oberyn heard the news standing in the training yard with the sun hard upon his shoulders, and something in his face went very still, the stillness of a snake before it strikes. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than Jon had ever heard it. He said that the gods, cruel as they were, had at last grown careless enough to leave a door unbarred, and that he intended to walk through it. He would go to King's Landing and offer himself as the accused man's champion, not out of love for the dwarf, who was nothing to him, but because to stand as champion was to earn the right to face the mountain with a spear in his hand and vengeance in his heart, and because he had waited 17 years for exactly this, and would not let it pass him by, though every wise counsel in Dorne begged him to. And then, in the same breath, he said that he would bring the boy with him. Doran opposed it with a vehemence that his ruined body could barely contain, wheeling himself into his brother's chambers late that night when the palace had gone quiet and the water gardens lay silvered under the moon. He said that to bring Jon into the lion's den was madness beyond reckoning, that the capital was a nest of eyes and ears where a single careless word could hang them all, that the boy's face was a Stark's face and his blood a secret worth more than any of their lives, and that to carry such a thing into the very heart of the enemy was to gamble everything they had preserved through long and patient years upon the throw of a single die. Oberyn heard him out with a patience that was itself a kind of contempt, and when Doran had spent himself, he answered only that he needed a squire, that a man could not ride to a trial without one, and that he would sooner have Jon at his back than any pampered lordling of the Reach. But they both knew the truth beneath the words, that Oberyn wished to keep the boy close because he had come to love him, and because a Targaryen in his shadow was a card that might yet be played should the trial go otherwise than he hoped. In the end, Doran could not stop him, for grief and passion together made a current that no argument of prudence could dam, and so he did the only thing left to a wise man who has lost the argument. He summoned Jon to his gallery before the dawn of their departure, and made him kneel, and he asked of him a vow, extracting it word by careful word, as a healer draws poison from a wound. Jon was to reveal nothing of his blood to any living soul, whatever came, whatever temptation or terror the capital pressed upon him. He was to hold the interests of Dorne above his own grief, to remember that vengeance was a fire that warmed no one and consumed everything it touched, and to return home whole if he could. Jon gave the vow slowly, the words heavy and reluctant on his tongue, for even as he spoke them he felt the murders Oberyn had named burning in him like coals that no promise could smother. And Doran, watching his face, understood that the boy meant to keep the letter of the oath, while its spirit slipped through his fingers like water. They rode north through the passes and out across the sun-scorched marches, and on that long road something formed between the man and the boy that neither had known they lacked. Oberyn trained him without mercy in the cool of each morning and the amber light of each evening, driving him with the spear and the short sword until his arms shook and his palms bled and grew calloused hard, and Jon learned more of the craft of killing in those weeks than in all his years before. But it was in the hours between, riding stirrup to stirrup beneath the wide, indifferent sky, that Oberyn gave him the greater gift. For he spoke of Elia as no one else had ever dared, of her gentleness and her frail health and her quick wit, of Rhaegar and his sad gray eyes and his harp and the war that his longing had kindled, of the burning of the world that had followed. He gave Jon a heritage in words, a face for the blood that ran in him, and in doing so he became to the boy something very near a father, fierce and reckless and loving all at once. And beneath a sky gone violet with the last of the light, with the towers of King's Landing still days distant, but drawing nearer with every hoofbeat, Jon turned to the man he had come to love and swore to him, softly and without ceremony, that whatever befell them in that cruel city, whatever the gods or the queen or the trial itself decreed, he would see the mountain answer for the murders of Elia and her children, and that he would stand at Oberyn's side when the reckoning came, though it cost him everything the vow to Doran had bidden him preserve. The city rose from the haze of the Blackwater like a wound that had never closed, its walls sun-baked and stinking, its streets choked with the press of 100,000 souls who had come to watch a man die. Jon rode into King's Landing at Oberyn's flank, with his hood drawn low and his heart already beating to the rhythm of the trial that awaited. And everywhere about them, the talk was of the imp who had slain a king, and of the champion of stone who would break him open before the eyes of the court. Oberyn wore the coming duel lightly, as he wore everything, laughing in the taverns and drinking the sour Dornish wine that the merchants brought up from the south. But Jon had watched him long enough now to see the stillness that lay beneath the ease, the coiled patience of a serpent sunning itself upon a warm rock, while it waited for the moment to strike. They had spent the last of their days upon the road, drilling, over and over, until Jon's arms ached, and his throat had gone raw with calling the movements. Oberyn had made him play the mountain, had bid him swing a weighted pole as Sir Gregor swung, and each time the boy brought the great blow down, the prince would name the flaw in it, the way the giant let his weight fall forward, the way his massive shoulders telegraphed the arc a heartbeat before the steel arrived, the way a man so huge could not check himself once committed. Jon had come to know those patterns as he knew his own breath, and Oberyn, watching the boy learn them with a swiftness that startled even him, had said that perhaps the sister who had died screaming in this very city had sent her sister's son back to help him settle her account. The day of the trial dawned white and merciless, the sun hammering down upon the walls of the Red Keep until the very stones seemed to shimmer with heat. Jon found a place among the small folk crowded against the barriers, hemmed in on every side by the reek of unwashed bodies and the buzz of 1,000 eager voices. And from that vantage, he watched Oberyn stride out into the dust in his supple leather and burnished copper, spear in hand, moving with a dancer's grace against the mountain of gray plate that lumbered to meet him. The red viper began to circle and to speak, and his voice carried across the yard in the terrible litany that Jon had heard him rehearse 100 times beneath the desert stars. The demand for a confession, the naming of Elia, the naming of her children, the ceaseless goading that drove the giant to fury and made him wild. The spear licked out and drew blood, again and again, and the mountain roared and swung his slab of a sword through the empty air, where Oberyn no longer stood. Jon's whole body was rigid, his fingers white where they gripped the rough wood of the barrier, and he watched the giant tire and stagger, watched the poison begin its slow work in the wounds that the prince had opened, watched Oberyn press ever closer as he demanded the words that would damn Tywin Lannister before all the realm. And then came the instant that Jon had lived 100 times in dread, the instant when the prince, drunk on the nearness of his vengeance, drew too close to the fallen giant and let his guard fall open in his hunger for the confession. "Oberyn!" Jon's cry tore from him, sharp and desperate, cutting clean across the murmur of the crowd. His hand. Whether it was the boy's voice alone, or the long weeks of drilling, or the sister's ghost that Oberyn half believed in, the prince heard it, and in the space of a single breath he stepped back and to the side, even as the mountain's gauntleted hand lunged for his ankle and closed upon nothing but air. The great fingers clawed the dust where he had stood, and Oberyn, laughing now, drove the poisoned spear down through the eye-slit of the helm and into the ruin of Gregor Clegane's face, and as he did, the giant bellowed out the confession at last, the names of Elia and Rhaenys and Aegon rolling from his dying tongue for every ear in King's Landing to hear. The silence that followed was a living thing. Jon saw Tywin Lannister rise from his seat with a face gone gray as old iron, saw the fury and the shame war across those cold features, for the whole court had heard the Warden of the West named as the master who had loosed the beast upon the children of a princess. Tyrion stood free and stunned in the dust, and the Dornish in the crowd took up a cheer that Tywin could not silence. And Jon understood in that ringing moment that his warning had bought far more than a single man's life, that a living red viper would carry Dorne's grievance into the very heart of the realm and would not be quieted. But Tywin Lannister was not a man to swallow such a humbling, and even as the cheering swelled, he was speaking low and urgent to the gold cloaks about him, and Jon read the command in the hardening of his mouth. Word reached Oberyn through a Dornish knight before the guards could close their ring, and the prince, wiping his blade, met Jon's eye across the yard and gave the smallest nod, and then they were moving, swept into the press of Dornish riders that gathered about them and bore them toward the horses and the gate. In the crush and the shouting, a man in Lannister livery was jostled hard against the barrier, and his gaze fell upon the boy at the prince's side, upon the long face and the gray eyes, and the dark hair that framed a look so achingly like the silver prince who had burned the world. And the spy stood frozen while the Dornishman swept past, and the message he carried would set Tywin's agents combing the southern roads for a gray-eyed boy, a hunt that would dog Dorne's councils in the moons to come back into the shadows of the keep. The road back to Sunspear was long and hot, and the dust of the King's Road gave way at last to the red earth and the shimmering distances of Dorne. And through all those weeks, the memory of that spy's frozen face rode with Jon like a second shadow. Oberyn spoke little of it, though the wound in his side ached beneath its bandages and slowed him more than his pride would admit. And when at last they passed beneath the old palace's arches and into the cool of shaded corridors, both of them understood that some quiet reckoning awaited them, that a message had outrun their horses and settled into the ears of the man who ruled all Dorne from his wheeled chair. Doran Martell received them not in the great hall, but in a small chamber near the water gardens, where the sound of children's laughter drifted faintly through a screen of latticed stone, and the pools threw rippling light across the ceiling. He sat with a blanket across his gouty legs and a cup of unwatered wine untouched at his elbow, and when Oberyn entered, he studied his brother's careful gait with eyes that missed nothing. Arianne was there also, standing by the window with her arms folded, and there was a tautness in her that Jon had learned to read over the long years of their closeness, a coiled readiness that told him she already knew what would be spoken here. For a while, no one gave the words their weight. Doran asked after Oberyn's wound and heard the tale of the trial from his brother's own lips, and there was a fierce satisfaction in his quiet approval, for the Mountain's confession had at last named Tywin Lannister before all the realm, and that naming could not be unspoken. Yet beneath the satisfaction lay a colder current, and it was Doran who at length turned it toward the surface. "A man came to me," he said, sent by one who watches for us in King's Landing. He carried a strange rumor that Prince Rhaegar's son did not perish at the sack, that he lives, and that he was seen at Oberyn's side in the yard of the Red Keep. His dark eyes settled upon Jon then, gentle and terrible at once. I have kept this secret for many years, kept it close as breath, and now it walks the streets of the capital in a spy's mouth. The time for silence has passed. We must decide together what you are to become. Arianne moved before her father had finished, crossing the chamber with the swift certainty of one who had rehearsed her heart 100 times in the dark. Then let us make him what he is, she said. A dragon. A true son of Rhaegar, raised in Dorne, loyal to Dorne, beholden to us for his very life. The realm groans under Lannister rule, and the lords of the Reach and the Stormlands would rally to a prince they could see and touch, a prince who is here, and not across the narrow sea. We would crown him, and through him hold the Iron Throne itself. Her voice softened as her gaze found Jon's, and in it lived something older than politics, a devotion she had never troubled to hide. You could be king. You were meant to be more than a fostered boy. But Doran shook his head slowly, and his patience had the weariness of long calculation behind it. A crown offered in haste is a blade held by the wrong end, he said. Across the sea, there is a girl of the blood of the dragon, Daenerys, and rumor says she has hatched dragons where the world believed them gone from it forever. Living dragons, Arianne. What can a boy's claim weigh against fire made flesh? To set Jon upon a throne is to invite every enemy of ours to name him a puppet of Dorne, and to divide the very cause we have waited so long to serve. He spread his thin hands. I would not spend our patience for a season's glory. The two of them fell to it in earnest then, father and daughter, their voices rising and falling against the murmur of the fountains, and Oberyn watched with a half-smile that hid his own uncertainty, and all the while Jon stood silent at the center of the storm they made of him. He had spent his whole life being spoken of and spoken for, first a bastard given to the sands, then a secret too dangerous to name, and now a peace to be moved, or a crown to be worn, and something in him that had been waiting a long time finally rose and took its shape. I will not be a puppet, he said, and though he did not raise his voice, the chamber quieted around it. I will not be lifted up, only to divide the last of my father's house against itself, to set my claim against my aunts, and see dragon warring against dragon, while the Lannisters laugh. That is not honor, and it is not sense. He looked to Arianne with an ache in his eyes for the thing she offered, and the thing he could not take. You raised me. I am Dorne's as surely as I am Rhaegar's, and I will not repay that by turning our strength into a knife, pointed at the only kin I have left across the world. He turned then to Doran. Send envoys east, not to crown a rival, but to seek her out, to join our blood to hers rather than break it against her. Let Daenerys and I stand together, and let Dorne be the hand that brings the dragons home united. For a long moment Doran said nothing, and the light from the pools moved across his lined face, and Oberyn's smile had gone still and thoughtful. Then the Prince of Dorne inclined his head, slowly, as a man acknowledges something he had not expected to find in one so young, and Jon saw that he had been heard. Envoys then, Doran said quietly, to the east, and already, in the corridors beyond the lattice, servants were being summoned, and the machinery of a decision made was beginning to turn. The ship that carried Jon east was a Dornish trader with a broad belly and patched sails, chosen precisely because it looked like nothing worth remarking upon, one more vessel among the hundreds that plied the warm waters between the free cities and the slaver coasts. Doran had arranged it so, for an embassy that announced itself with banners and gilded prows would have drawn every knife in Essos, and the men who sailed with Jon were not soldiers dressed as such, but merchants and stewards, and one gray-haired diplomat named Oberyn Martell, a cousin of the ruling house, whose soft voice and softer eyes concealed a mind honed by decades of quiet negotiation in the courts of the East. Jon spent much of the voyage at the rail, watching the coast slide by, the white cliffs giving way to golden dunes, and then to green hills that were nothing like the ochre country he had known. The sea itself unsettled him, its ceaseless motion beneath his feet, the way the horizon offered no fixed thing to hold, and in the long hours when the wind pushed them steadily onward, he found himself circling the same question again and again, worrying at it the way a tongue worries a loose tooth. He was going to Meereen to offer alliance, yes, but underneath the diplomat's mission lay a private and more difficult reckoning, for he did not know whether he sought a throne or merely a place where a boy who had never quite belonged anywhere might finally be claimed by his own blood. Manfrey, watching him from beneath the shade of an awning, said little, but once, as the sun sank into a sea gone the color of hammered bronze, the old man observed that the strongest position at any table belonged to the man who wanted least, and that Jon would do well to know his own hunger before he sat across from a queen who had learned to read hunger in others. Meereen rose out of the heat like a thing dreamed. Its great pyramids stepped against a sky white with glare, its walls the color of old brick, and above the tallest of them, a banner bearing a black dragon on red hung limp in the still air. Jon came ashore in plain traveling clothes, and though the streets teemed with freedmen and the acrid smell of a city remaking itself in blood and hope, he saw everywhere the marks of a rule struggling to hold, the burned scaffolds, the wary eyes, the soldiers of a dozen origins gathered under one impossible girl. When at last he was brought before Daenerys Targaryen in the vast hall at the pyramid's summit, the light came slanting through high windows and fell upon a woman younger than the stories had made her, and harder, silver-haired and violet-eyed, seated upon a bench rather than a throne, as though she had not yet decided whether she would allow herself to sit as a queen sits. They circled one another with words, the two of them, each a piece of the same broken house, and Jon felt the wariness in her like a held breath. She looked at his dark hair and his long, stark face and saw little of Rhaegar in him, and she said as much, gently and not without suspicion, and Jon did not flinch from it. He told her of Dorne, of Elia, who had been her good sister and whose murder had never been answered, of the men who had raised him and taught him that power, without patience, was only a slower kind of ruin. When her advisors pressed him, the sellsword captain, with his easy insolence, and the eunuch with his careful stillness, and the exiled knight who watched Jon as a wolf watches a stranger near the fold, Jon answered them with the statecraft Doran and Oberyn had pressed into him across long years, and he did not beg, and he did not bend. He offered her not his knee, but his hand. The North and Dorne, he said, would come to her cause not as subjects delivered up to a conqueror, but as partners bound by compact. And he laid out the terms of it plainly, the marriages and the councils and the shared voice in matters of the realm, so that when the words were done, Daenerys understood that she was not receiving a supplicant, but bargaining with a claimant she could not simply command. Something shifted in her face at that, a flicker of respect warring with the old solitary pride that had carried her across a continent, and Sir Barristan, who had known the true Rhaegar, murmured something to her that Jon could not hear, and the queen's eyes returned to him with a new and measuring weight. Yet it was not the bargaining that changed the shape of that hall, but the tidings that had followed Jon across the water, filtering east through the ragged passage of northern refugees who had fled the wars that had gutted their homeland, while its king marched south, and through the sparse and frantic messages of the Night's Watch that reached even these distant ports. Jon spoke of them last, when the matter of thrones had been set upon the table between them, and he spoke of a cold coming down from beyond the wall, of a war that no crown could win alone. He had never truly known the North that was his by half his blood, had never met the brother named Robb who had risen as king in the North and fallen in a war Jon had watched only from afar. But the North lived in him all the same, a summons in the marrow, and as he described the dead that walked and the winter that did not end, his voice lost its measured diplomacy and became something raw and certain. Daenerys listened, and her advisors listened, and the sellsword's smirk faded from his mouth. For the first time since he had entered that hall, the queen was not weighing what Jon wanted from her, but what he feared, and the fear was so unlike ambition that it could not be dismissed. She leaned forward upon her bench, the light gilding the silver of her hair, and asked him quietly whether he truly believed such a thing. And Jon met her eyes and said that he did not believe it. He knew it. There was a silence in that hall after his words, a silence that seemed to gather weight the longer it lasted, and Daenerys did not fill it with the practiced assurances of a queen accustomed to men who wanted her throne. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and the braziers threw their restless light across the stone, and somewhere beyond the high windows, the sea moved against the walls of Meereen with the patience of something that had been moving so for 1,000 years. When at last she spoke, she did not speak of crowns or bended knees. She asked him what he proposed, and Jon told her plainly that he proposed neither to serve beneath her nor to set himself above her, but to stand at her side, two dragons with a single purpose, each keeping the claim that blood had given them, and neither demanding that the other kneel. It was a thing without precedent, and her advisors stirred and murmured, for they were men and women who understood the world as a ladder upon which one climbed by placing others below, and here was a proposal that dissolved the very rungs. Yet the Dornish men who had come with Jon had crafted this offer with the care of jewelers, and they laid it out now in their unhurried southern voices, speaking of shared rule as the marriage of two rivers into one greater flood, of a realm reforged not by conquest alone, but by union. Jon would hold the North, which was his by the half of his blood that no one in that room could name without wonder, and he would help her hold the rest, and together they would face the cold that no single crown could turn back. Daenerys listened, and the calculation that had lived so long behind her eyes gave way, by degrees, to something warmer and more perilous, which was hope. She agreed before the night was through. There was no grand ceremony to mark it, no herald, no fanfare, only a queen and a hidden prince clasping hands across a table strewn with the maps of a distant country, and the freed men and women of her cause looking on, and the Dornish spears standing witness in the shadows. They would sail for Westeros together, the two of them, their strength bound as equals, and the words they spoke to seal it were quiet words, but they carried the weight of everything that had brought them to that room across all the years and all the seas. Far away in the water gardens of Dorne, where the fountains sang their endless soft music and the fruit hung heavy on the trees, Doran Martell received the raven that carried this news, and he read it twice, and then he set it down upon his knee and let his gaze wander out across the pale sand and the children playing in the shallow pools. He had waited so long that the waiting had become a kind of second skin, a patience so deep that even those closest to him had mistaken it for surrender. Now he summoned his court, and the lords and ladies of Dorne came to him, wondering what could rouse the sick and silent prince to such a gathering. And before them all, he spoke the truth he had guarded, like a coal kept alive through the longest winter. He had taken in a Targaryen child who was thought to be a bastard, he told them, had raised him within the walls of Dorne with love and with purpose, had shaped him and guided him, and set him at last upon the path that led to the true queen's side. The murmur that rose from them was the sound of a whole people understanding, in a single breath, that the thing they had thirsted for since Elia and her children died beneath the Lannister banners had come to pass, not through the reckless fury they had craved, but through the long, slow cunning of the prince, who had never seemed to move at all. House Martell would be remembered as the architect of the dragon's return, the avenger of Elia by the surer weapon of endurance. And Doran, whose legs no longer bore him, felt something straighten within him that no gout could bend. Oberyn was there when the news came, alive and unbroken, the venom of a trial by combat long behind him, and he laughed aloud with a joy that filled the gardens. He had known the boy as a child, had taught him something of the spear and something of the wine, and a great deal about the ways men wear their grievances. And now he stood before the court and named Jon as his own kin, not by the careful language of politics, but by the fierce plain claim of a man acknowledging his blood. The sand snakes cheered their father, and the fountains sang, and it seemed for a moment that all the grief that had poisoned Dorne for a generation was draining away into the warm, bright water. And there was Arianne, who had been raised to rule after her father, and who had watched the boy grow into the man across the years with an interest that was never wholly political. When the terms of the alliance were laid before her, she did not receive them as a loss, nor as a farewell to any tenderness she might have nursed, but as the shape of a future she could seize with both hands. A union in the Dornish fashion was proposed, one that would tie House Martell not to a distant throne, but to Jon himself, to the very center of the new order that was rising, and she considered it with the shrewd delight of a woman who had spent her life being told to wait her turn. She would not wait. She would ride the dragon's tide into the heart of the reforged realm, Dorne at her back, and Jon at her side, and the marriage that bound them would be at once a matter of state and a matter of two people who had chosen each other with open eyes. She sent her answer north across the narrow sea, and it was yes, for the pact with Daenerys had been sealed as an alliance of equals and not a marriage, leaving Jon free to bind his own heart where it had long since been given, and the terms of it were still being copied fair by candlelight when the first of Daenerys's ships began to make ready in the harbor. The fleet that crossed the narrow sea was unlike any that had come to Westeros before it, for it carried not the ambition of a conqueror, but the weight of a warning that had gone unheeded for far too long. The ships came ashore beneath a gray and lidless sky, and the men who disembarked upon the cold stones of the eastern coast were a strange braiding of two worlds: the lean spearmen of Dorne, who had never in their lives seen frost upon a blade of grass walking beside the hard-eyed survivors of the north, who had known little else. Above them all wheeled the dragons, three great shadows that turned the daylight uncertain wherever they passed. And the small folk, who watched from their hovels, did not know whether to fall to their knees in worship or in terror. Jon Snow stood at the prow of the foremost ship as it ground against the shingle, and though he wore Dornish steel and carried himself with the loose, watchful ease that Oberyn had drilled into him across long years of practice, there was in his bearing something that belonged wholly to the north, some inheritance of stillness and sorrow that no southern sun had burned away. And though he had grown up far from the wolves of his father's house, a great white direwolf had come down out of the haunted forest in that first battle and would not leave his side. He had come home to a country that had never truly been his home, and he had come not to take a throne, but to fight a war that most of the realm still believed to be a nursery tale. That was the argument he had won, and winning it had cost him more than any battle. When the terms of alliance had first been laid, there had been lords who counseled striking south at once, at the Golden Lions who had made themselves comfortable upon the ruin of so many houses. But Jon had refused, with a quiet immovability that unsettled men accustomed to louder passions. The true war, he told them, was not in the south at all, and every hour they spent settling old scores was an hour paid in blood they could not spare. He spoke of the dead as a man speaks of something he has seen with his own eyes, and though few of the assembled lords believed him, there was enough in his voice to make them uneasy, and enough dragons at his back to make them agreeable. So the great host turned north instead of west, gathering to it the remnants of those houses that had kept faith with the memory of the Starks through all the long years of division. They came in scattered bands at first, hollow-cheeked men who had lost their homes and their lieges and had nothing left to give but their swords, and they looked upon Jon with a wariness that was almost hunger, searching his face for some proof of the blood they had been told he carried. He gave them no speeches about his birth. He gave them orders and shelter and a plan, and slowly, as the marching days wore on, and the cold deepened with every league, that was worth more to them than any pedigree. When at last they reached the country beneath the wall, they found it already broken open, the great ice barrier breached at last, where the others had raised their own dead against it for a year, the watch overrun, and the gate torn open, and through the wound in the world the dead were pouring in a silent, endless tide. The first battle was very nearly the last, for the sheer number of them staggered even the boldest of the southern lords, and there were men of Dorne who wept openly at the sight of a horror they had crossed the whole of the world to disbelieve. But Jon did not weep, and he did not falter, and in the gray chaos of that first clash, he became something the North had been waiting a generation to see, without knowing it waited. He fought the dead the way Oberyn had taught him to fight men who outnumbered him, with poison drawn along the edges of 1,000 spears, with the patience to give ground where ground could be spared, and the ruthlessness to take it back when the enemy overreached, with feigned retreats that drew the mindless host into killing grounds where the dragons could fall upon them in curtains of fire. He turned the very numbers of the dead against them, letting their hunger drag them into traps that a slower, prouder general would never have laid, and where the old northern way of standing and dying with honor would have ended in annihilation. The crooked Dornish cunning bought survival one desperate hour at a time. The lords saw it. They saw a boy they had been told to accept on the strength of his mother's name outthink and outlast an enemy that had no equal in all their long books of war, and the acceptance they granted him afterward was not given for his blood at all, but for his own worth. That was the moment his blood ceased to matter and his worth began, and the two things fused so completely in the eyes of the North that no man could ever again pull them apart. Daenerys fought beside him, or rather above him, her dragons carving the darkness into ruin, while her ground commanders held the line she and Jon had drawn together, across councils lit by guttering fires. The cost of it was terrible. Whole valleys strewn with the fallen, villages emptied, and days when the outcome hung upon nothing more substantial than exhaustion and stubbornness. Yet inch by frozen inch, the tide was turned, the breach was contested, and when the Pale King, who marshaled the dead, was at last brought down beneath dragonfire and Dornish spears upon the frozen field, the great silence of the dead gave way to the ordinary sounds of living men who had survived. When the worst of it had passed, when the field lay quiet beneath a sky that had finally begun to lighten, the surviving lords gathered in a hall of stone and smoke, and they looked at one another with the raw astonishment of men who had expected to die and had not. They had bled together for something larger than any of their grudges, and in the two Targaryens who had led them through it, they saw, for the first time in years, not a claim to be resisted, but a peace that might actually be kept. And into that fragile, hopeful quiet, someone rose to speak the question that would decide everything that came after. The question, when it came, was not of who should rule, but of how, and it was Jon who answered it, not with the sword he had carried through the long night, but with the patience that Dorne had taught him in a childhood of shaded courtyards and slow, deliberate speech. He had grown up between worlds, a boy of the north raised beneath a southern sun, and he had learned early that the sharpest instrument in any hall was rarely the blade, but the careful arrangement of interests so that no man felt he had lost everything, and every man felt he had gained something worth the keeping. So when he stood in that smoke-dimmed hall with the ash of the war still on his cloak, he did not speak of conquest or of thrones melted from the swords of the vanquished, but of charters, of councils, of a realm bound not by the fear of a single seat of iron, but by the mutual promises of kingdoms that had learned, in the worst winter any of them had known, how much they needed one another. Daenerys listened, and in her listening there was a kind of grace that surprised the lords who had feared her, for she had crossed a world and burned a great deal of it to reach this hall, and she might have demanded the old submission, the bent knee before the single throne. Yet she had watched Jon govern through the war, had seen how the men of the north followed him without needing to be commanded, how the Dornish spoke his name as one of their own, and she understood that the peace she wanted could not be forged from ash alone. She had come to take a throne alone, and the old fire in her rebelled at sharing it, but she had watched the north follow Jon where they would follow no queen, and she chose, not without struggle, that a crown shared was better than a crown that broke the realm anew, a crown that presided over a confederation rather than crushing it, each kingdom keeping its own laws and its own councils, and sending its voice to a greater council that met to settle the matters that touched them all. It was Dorne's own philosophy, written large across the whole of the realm, the belief that a thing held loosely endures longer than a thing gripped until it breaks. And it had come to Westeros not through war alone, but through the boy Robert Baratheon had once sent south, in a gesture he never fully understood. Jon took his place not as a warden serving another's rule, but as a co-sovereign, crowned in his own right, ruling north and south together as the bridge between them. And there were those who marveled that a man offered every reason to retreat into the solitude of the north had instead chosen to remain, to wield openly the three inheritances that ran in his blood. He was Stark by the father who had raised him in memory if not in flesh, Dornish by the family who had shaped his mind and his patience, and Targaryen by the truth that had been hidden from him and given back at last, and he refused to set any of them down. Where another man might have surrendered his claims out of guilt or exhaustion, or the simple weariness of being wanted by too many, Jon held all of them at once and made of them a single thing, a rule that belonged to no one region and therefore could speak for all of them. In the warm halls of Sunspear, where the news arrived on the wings of ravens and then on the tongues of returning riders, Doran Martell sat in his chair by the water gardens and let the long labor of his life come finally to rest. He had waited so many years, moving pieces across a board that only he could see in full, enduring the impatience of those who thought him weak, and now the pieces had come home. Elia was avenged, not through the crude vengeance of a knife in the dark, but through the restoration of the very house her murderers had tried to erase. The Targaryens ruled again, gentled by charters and councils into something wiser than the dynasty that had fallen. And the boy he had raised, the quiet, grave-eyed child sent to him by a king who meant it half as insult and half as trust, had become the keystone of the whole remade realm. Doran wept, though few saw it, and the tears were not of grief, but of a completion so total that his body scarcely knew how to hold it. Oberyn, who had trained that boy in the yard until sweat ran and lessons stuck, and the sand snakes, who had counted him a brother and a rival and a friend, took their own fierce pride in what he had become, for they had shaped the serpent that now stood coiled and gleaming among the greatest powers of the world. They had given him the venom of Dorne, the refusal to bow, the long memory and the longer patience, and they saw those things in every measured word he spoke in council, in every quarrel he cooled before it could catch fire, in the way he ruled beside Arianne with a partnership that made the two of them stronger than either alone. For Arianne was his consort now, and their marriage bound Dorne to the new order not as a servant but as its beating heart, the philosophy of the water gardens made into the philosophy of a continent. They had a family, and children who would grow up as Jon once had, between suns and snows, belonging to everything and diminished by nothing. And the realm they would inherit was not the brittle thing of iron and fear that had come before, but something more supple, more forgiving, built to bend beneath the winters that would always return and to rise again when they passed. The old Iron Throne had been unmade, and in its place stood a thing that no single ambition could seize entire, and the man at the center of it had come there not by refusing his crowns, but by carrying all of them at once. And so the realm settled into its long peace, changed utterly from what it might have been, all of it flowing outward from one small decision made years before, a decision that gave Westeros not a reluctant northern king dragged to a throne he never wanted, but a ruler who chose confederation over conquest, because Dorne, and only Dorne, had taught him that a realm gripped too tight always breaks into the sun, and the sun had made of him something the world had never seen. And this brings us to the end of this alternate history. If you enjoyed exploring how events might have unfolded differently, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. We dive into new stories from the world of Westeros every single day, imagining the choices, battles, alliances, and destinies that could have completely changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. And if you'd like to explore even more stories, our Lorekeeper members unlock a brand new exclusive alternate history every single week. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think would have happened next? Did this version of history end better than the original? Or would you have taken the story in a completely different direction? Leave your ideas in the comments, because many of the best future stories come directly from your suggestions. Thank you so much for watching and for spending your time with me. I'll see you tomorrow with another alternate history from Westeros. Until then, peace out.